Welcome to Philosophical Shorts. I am Dr. Alexander Mosley, and in this video we're looking at political realism. The notion of realism is used in different senses, all reflecting a particular school of thought that seeks to know how things really are. For example, in literature, psychology, art, but also we find it in standard philosophical fields such as language, metaphysics, and in this case, politics. Realism in politics seeks to deal with the reality of political affairs as they are, rather than what they should ideally be, or what we would wish them to be. It focuses on the constant potential for conflict and competition in the political game between agents such as states, kings, presidents, political parties, or lobby groups. It is thus opposed to what is generally known as political idealism and its variant modern liberalism, that seek to uphold higher values than those of war and competition. Political realism thus stands in contrast to the optimism of the political or philosophical idealist, who is typically enthused by the role that reason, rationality, can play or should play in bringing people together in harmony. Political realists often call such idealists visionaries, theorists, or dreamers. Now, the first problem we can put on the table is that realists divide amongst themselves about what is the real situation, politically or militarily speaking. It's a typical philosophical problem. We often ask, what is the reality that you are talking about? After all, how we individually see reality is based on perception. And the problem is that perception is coloured by a positional perspective among a host of competing alternative positions from which we could view an event, say. And following from this, there is the potential for different interpretations regarding the aforementioned event. Add to that, our interpretations are based on peculiar dogmas we hold, or by the brain's desire to impose certain patterns based on previous patterns seen. Oh look, those stars clumped together look like a dog. Our interpretations are also based on personal experience, adherence to others' influences, or even by our current emotional disposition, and more importantly, by our immediate reflection, or thinking fast, as Daniel Kahneman teaches us, and further interpretation of those experiences, or thinking slow. And if this is true for any individual, the problem is intensified when it comes to a group of people perusing the data around them. Data, the supposed reality we review, do not throw truths at us once we have amassed facts and figures and stared at them long enough as if reading tea leaves. We may approach data with preconceptions of what we're looking for. The data themselves are categorized according to other preconceptions of what we are collecting. In a nutshell, exploring and explaining reality comes from the beliefs we hold regarding how we explore and how we should even attempt to explain anything. So what reality are political philosophers expounding when they claim that they see political events for what they are? Nonetheless, putting aside such epistemological concerns regarding how we know anything, we can follow regular academic habits and review some basic schools of thought. And we begin with classical or pragmatic realism. Classical realists pragmatically straddle two positions. Firstly, the bare-knuckled realism of the well-defended and trained warrior, a position that may also be enthralled by informing a self or national identity through war and the securing of hegemony, or at least relative security over others. But secondly, they also reach out for the hoped-for peace that idealists have always entertained, which can only come about by being constantly adaptive to changing political situations, by being constantly on guard and prepared. The classical realist leans into what we can call a more prudential and pragmatic review of political affairs around them. Being prudent means reading the neighbours' intentions carefully, keeping an eye on their military exercises and build-ups, monitoring military expenditures, hardware and training programs, and learning from psychology and the literature on the human condition, and so on. The logical disposition or leaning of classical realists is to explain policies according to national interest and the balance of power principle, in which no competing polity, nation or empire is permitted to expand too much or to become too powerful, as that would upset the balance and hence affect national interests. I shall leave the critique of these propositions aside for now, as we're just looking at the relevant schools of thought. So classical realists do maintain that there are moral values to uphold, but they recognise that without contingency plans, such ideals as peace between peoples would come to naught. Like guardians on watch, they are aware of the wolf-like predators in their midst and in surrounding countries, reflecting a Hobbesian conception of the international arena as being inherently lawless. That is, there is no overarching government structure that would uphold the rule of law. Even today, such realists would not turn to the United Nations, for its history is replete with inconsistencies and is divided at the very top of its Security Council between often mutually opposing nations. In a similar vein, such pragmatic realists may also echo the English philosopher John Locke's review of Hobbes's conception of the basic condition of the world, domestic or international, that most people are good, but a few would ruin society, and so we must prepare for them, deter, and even stop them when necessary. And so, ultimately leaning into idealist or moral thinking, classical realists can assert the need for mutually beneficial alliances and treaties with similarly minded peoples, and will tend to see politicians working for the good of the community as being honourable, and they will accept that wars too can be justifiable on moral grounds, as well as out of necessity. Prudence and practicality permeate the classical realists' personality and principles. They may also hold hopes in common with idealists of expanding education to raise people's consciousness about the dark consequences of war, or to explain that mutually benefiting commerce between peoples reduces the need for economically driven wars, or to assert that the more the governments become transparent and accountable for their deeds, the less is their temptation for interfering with other nations' affairs. But here perhaps I have moved our realists too far in the direction of a kind of ideal society that, funnily enough, the idealists would certainly applaud. In contrast, strict political realists, also called pessimistic, or as I am calling them here, dualistic realists, drop any pretense of acting morally in the political field. Accordingly, the political arena can be construed as either a permanent battlefield or, when peace reigns, a temporary calm, like a no-man's land that the unwary should fear or to tread unprepared before the inevitable onslaught. Following the moral precepts of the Italian philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli, they split the human world into two, the private world and the political world, hence their ethical dualism, that proclaims the rule of morality in one field of action but not in another, politics being beyond the reach of ethics. Yet, these realists may still live by higher ideals, such as being honest to friends and family in their private life. But when it comes to the political arena, they proclaim that morality ends, and that all is fair to ensure the survival and expansion of their interests, or those of the state that they work for, or in some respects which they use for their own ends. While the classical dualist reaches out to ensure a moral realm in politics but prepares for the worst among the neighbours, the dualist or strict realist does not permit morality to enter the political game. To paraphrase, modify, a famous phrase by Karl von Clausewitz in his On War, politics is a continuation of war by other means. For such realists, there are no overarching or universal codes of conduct to be upheld between political agents, such as nation-states, or even to be upheld in the competition for positions within a government or a political party. Signed treaties or international laws are merely paperwork that are signed to appease the enemy for a period, while working on preparations to defend or attack them in the future. Thus there is no accountability in the political arena, except whether the politician or nation survives or is victorious in battle. All political action is to be focused on the survival and flourishing of the state relative to others, and that implies using anything at their disposal to win. Peace, if achieved, is just a pause in the perpetual political game of jostling and waging war, military or economic, and for such realists all is glory to the state, which they seek to embody or to lead on a messianic journey. The dominant theme is pursuing the ends using whatever means are available. Now, the more subtly minded viewers may detect an ethic existing within this strict or dualistic realism, one that places emphasis on personal aggrandizement or state power over others. Indeed, well spotted. The implicit morality revolves around the theory that might determines the right, an ancient argument that was first critiqued by Plato, and which is quickly rejected by a realization that what determines might is typically a temporary strength that lasts as long as the leader, the Führer, the president, the king, and so on, has the strength to fight. That the right is dependent on a person produces conflicting notions of right as a new regent takes over. Hence the alleged ethic is merely a relativistic shifting of the good that one day may condone the killing of civilians and the next day prohibit such massacres. Whimsicality is of course not universalizable, but that's not to say that morality must be universalizable, but it is difficult to square mutable, changing values with any sense of ethical order that permits human flourishing or the recognition of the wise through the ages that there are some values that we all seek as obviously good. Finally, there is hardcore realism, for the want of a term. So all this logically leads us to the third school of thought, one that sees no division at all between civil life and political life. These realists see their entire modus operandi as predicated on the need to compete, use whatever means at their disposal to flourish as they see it, to eliminate competition figuratively or literally. Family, friends, corporations, government departments, cabinets and political leaders, as well as influential celebrities and the conspicuous rich, are all there to be used in exploitative relationships to further self-interested pursuits of power and privilege, and to be dropped when such alliances no longer are needed. These are truly sociopaths, we could say, but whom it could also be said by the philosophical critic that they believe that they have a moral right to disdain the rest of the population and see others as a means to their own ends. As such, it is an ethical position, the ethic of the tyrant. While the psychologist and political historian may underline the narcissism and megalomania of such people, philosophers, including Aristotle, note that periodically some are born who are to break the cultural and political mould of their generation, and who are not subject to the laws and morals that govern their peers. They, Aristotle calls, a great-souled people, for whom the ordinary rules of society should not constrain, for they, like the gods, are far above such rules. It sounds like a very good PR job. For Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great when Alexander was young. Aristotle was in with the Macedonian court and naturally seems to have defended his financial and political links with Macedonia. His pupil, Alexander, went on to conquer most of the Middle East and the Persian Empire, taking his armies as far as India and Afghanistan. Yet we can ask, would a great-souled person be so interested in warfare? That seems incongruous with what we understand of morality, and leans into an excuse for the wayward or the murderous. We can consider that such supposedly great-souled warriors exist far below the consciousness of the great-souled saints of the world, the people who walk the earth to help others raise their consciousness or to generate peace on earth. Indeed, Alexander seems to have met an Indian sage, Dandamis, whom he threatened to kill for not bowing before him, this the conqueror of the world. According to an Indian telling of the story, Dandamis laughed at Alexander's presumptuousness, calmly educating the younger man that the land belongs to no one, and before you there were others who claimed it, and after you there will be others who will say it is theirs. Apocryphal or not, the story is a theme that is passed down the ages when military hubris encounters humble wisdom. In the beginning of Les Miserables, Victor Hugo has Napoleon observed by a curate of the church, Monsieur Myriel. Napoleon turns and demands who is staring at him. Quel est ce bonhomme qui me regarde? Sire, dit Monsieur Myriel, vous regardez un bonhomme, et moi je regarde un grand homme. Chacun de nous peut profiter. Sire, said Monsieur Myriel, you are looking at a good man, and I at a great man. Each of us can profit by it. Now, Aristotle's rationalization was a rather unfortunate one, for one of such otherwise incredible erudition. His reasoning was picked up by later philosophers who emphasized the nature of the hero or the Superman. They deployed variations on the theme of the great hero, some leaning into the goodness inherent in morally oriented people, but inevitably the notion was picked up by individuals or their sycophants, who saw their malevolent hero demons as somehow quasi-divine, whether they were Napoleon or Hitler. Indeed, when we review the propaganda of the last century, the hero worshipping of modern Alexanders is conspicuous, and so too is the casualty list of their actions. For the sinister hardcore realists, any means may be used in the private and public spheres to take advantage of others for their own ends. Intelligence for them is a tool to rule. Economic wealth is a treasure to take. People are resources to exploit, whether they be the anonymous masses or the closest loved ones. Here, no difference may divide private and public, political and polite society. All is fair in love and in war, which does not say much for such people's love lives. Now, this video won't be going into a critique of realism. I've touched on it a little bit, and that's for another video, as it were. Just to recap, we have encountered three kinds of realist. The pragmatic or classical realist, who admits the possibility of morality in public and political affairs. The dualist realist, who argues that the political sphere is amoral, or without any sense or need of morality. And the hardcore realist, who rejects morality in the private, as well as in the public sphere. It is up to psychologists, biographers and historians to review the details of particular individuals' lives whom we can detect as engaging in realpolitik, and the extent to which they fall into one of the schools of thought. Ironically, the reality is often complex. Individuals may be motivated by fluctuating perceptions of power and prestige and what is permissible, but still, such reviews can highlight the general disposition of people into the hardcore, the dualist, or the pragmatic sense of being in the world. Your thoughts are always welcome on the comments board and will be attended to as time and my life's competing values permit. Thank you for listening.